In 1944, Italian partisans discovered something that would shock the world. Hidden in the basement of a villa outside Milan, they found detailed records of experiments conducted on human beings. The signatures at the bottom of these documents all bore the same name, Benito Mussolini. But this was just the tip of the iceberg. For over 2 decades, the man who proclaimed himself the founder of fascism unleashed a reign of terror that stretched from the streets of Rome to the deserts of Africa. While history often focuses on his alliance with Hitler, the true extent of Mussolini's cruelty remained buried in classified files for decades. Today, we're uncovering the most disturbing actions of a dictator whose thirst for power knew no bounds. What you're about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about Benito Mussolini. Before Mussolini ever seized power, he was already perfecting the art of brutality. In 1919, his black shirts began what they called punitive expeditions against anyone who opposed fascism. These weren't political rallies or debates. They were systematic campaigns of violence designed to terrorize entire communities into submission. The methods were calculated and cruel. Black shirts would arrive in towns at night, dragging people from their homes. They forced opponents to drink castor oil mixed with gasoline until victims collapsed in agony. Others were beaten with clubs embedded with nails, a practice Mussolini personally approved. Local officials who refused to cooperate were stripped, covered in tar, and paraded through town squares as examples. In the town of Sarzana, Mussolini's men surrounded a peaceful labor meeting and set the building on fire. When people tried to escape through the windows, they were beaten back into the flames. 15 people died that night, but Mussolini's newspaper the next day celebrated it as a cleansing of socialist parasites. But this was just the beginning. Once Mussolini tasted blood, his appetite for violence would only grow stronger. When Mussolini became prime minister in 1922, many believed his violent days were behind him. They were wrong. Within months, he established the OVRA, a secret police force that made the black shirts look like amateurs. The OVRA operated with a single mandate: eliminate any threat to Mussolini's power by any means necessary. The organization's methods were refined through years of practice. They perfected psychological torture techniques that left no visible marks but broke victims mentally. One former OVRA agent later described how they would place prisoners in completely dark cells for months, playing the same song on repeat until the person's mind fractured. When that wasn't enough, they moved to physical methods that pushed the boundaries of human endurance. The case of Giacomo Matteotti reveals the depths of Mussolini's ruthlessness. Matteotti was a socialist politician who had begun investigating fascist financial corruption. In June 1924, he was kidnapped by OVRA agents in broad daylight on a Roman street. His body was found 2 months later, buried in a shallow grave outside the city. The autopsy revealed he had been kept alive for days, subjected to systematic torture before being killed. When evidence emerged linking the murder directly to Mussolini's office, the dictator's response was chilling. Rather than deny involvement, he publicly stated that political enemies deserved whatever fate befell them. The message was clear: cross Mussolini and face the consequences. Nothing prepared the world for what Mussolini would unleash in Africa. His invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 wasn't just a military campaign. It was a laboratory for testing the most horrific weapons and tactics of modern warfare on an entire population. Mussolini authorized the use of chemical weapons on a scale never seen before. Italian planes dropped mustard gas canisters over Ethiopian villages, targeting not just soldiers but civilians, livestock, and even water sources. The gas burned through skin and lungs, causing agonizing deaths that could take days or weeks. Entire communities were wiped out, leaving behind landscapes that remained poisoned for years. But the chemical attacks were just one element of a broader campaign of extermination. Mussolini issued orders for the systematic destruction of Ethiopian culture itself. Italian forces burned ancient monasteries that had stood for over 1,000 years. They destroyed libraries containing irreplaceable manuscripts and religious artifacts. The goal wasn't just conquest, it was the complete erasure of Ethiopian civilization. The treatment of prisoners revealed Mussolini's complete disregard for human life. Ethiopian soldiers and civilians were herded into concentration camps where conditions were deliberately designed to cause maximum suffering. Food was withheld for days at a time. Medical care was non-existent. Prisoners were forced to perform back-breaking labor in the desert heat without water breaks. Those who collapsed were left to die where they fell. One Italian officer's diary, discovered decades later, describes scenes that haunt historians to this day. He wrote about mass executions where hundreds of Ethiopians were lined up and machine-gunned down. The bodies were then burned in huge pyres that could be seen for miles, sending a message of terror across the countryside. The international community's muted response only emboldened Mussolini. He had tested the limits of civilized tolerance and found them wanting. This success in Africa would directly influence his later alliance with Nazi Germany and his participation in the Holocaust. While the world watched Mussolini's aggression abroad, few knew about the systematic elimination of threats within Italy itself. The dictator had created a paranoid surveillance state where neighbors were encouraged to inform on neighbors, and loyalty was measured by one's willingness to betray friends and family. The case of the Rosselli brothers exemplifies Mussolini's reach beyond Italy's borders. Carlo and Nello Rosselli were Italian intellectuals who had fled to France and continued criticizing fascism from exile. In 1937, they were both found dead on a French roadside, their bodies bearing signs of prolonged torture. French authorities initially blamed local criminals, but evidence later emerged showing Havre agents had tracked the brothers across international borders and executed them on Mussolini's personal orders. Within Italy, Mussolini's paranoia reached extraordinary levels. He ordered the creation of detailed files on every citizen, tracking their political opinions, personal relationships, and even private conversations. Anyone expressing doubt about fascism, even in casual conversation, could find themselves disappeared in the middle of the night. The fate of Italy's intellectuals was particularly brutal. University professors who refused to sign loyalty oaths were not simply fired. They were sent to internal exile on remote islands where they lived in primitive conditions under constant surveillance. Many never returned. Those who did were broken shells of their former selves, serving as living warnings to others who might consider resistance. Children were not spared from this surveillance network. Mussolini established youth organizations that encouraged children to report on their parents and teachers. One documented case involved a 12-year-old boy who reported his father for making jokes about Mussolini. The father was arrested that same night and sent to a labor camp, where he died within 6 months. Mussolini's alliance with Hitler transformed him from a regional dictator into a participant in history's greatest crimes. But his collaboration went far beyond political convenience. It revealed a shared ideology of racial hatred that Mussolini embraced with enthusiasm. In 1938, Mussolini introduced Italy's racial laws, systematically stripping Jews of their civil rights. But unlike Germany's gradual approach, Mussolini's implementation was swift and comprehensive. Jewish Italians were banned from schools, universities, and most professions overnight. Their property was confiscated, their businesses closed, their children expelled from schools. The deportation of Italian Jews revealed Mussolini's complete moral bankruptcy. When Nazi officials requested assistance rounding up Jews for transport to concentration camps, Mussolini not only agreed, but provided Italian police and soldiers to help with the operations. Italian forces participated in raids that dragged families from their homes in the middle of the night, separating children from parents, often permanently. One of the most disturbing aspects was Mussolini's personal involvement in these decisions. Historians have found documents bearing his handwritten notes, approving specific deportation lists. He personally reviewed the names of Jewish families and marked them for transport to death camps. This wasn't bureaucratic indifference. It was active participation in genocide. The fate of Rome's Jewish community illustrates the horror of Mussolini's collaboration. On October 16, 1943, German and Italian forces surrounded the Jewish quarter and began systematic arrests. Over 1,000 people were loaded onto cattle cars bound for Auschwitz. Only 16 would ever return. Survivors later testified that Italian police officers were particularly cruel during the roundup, taking pleasure in the suffering they were inflicting on their own countrymen. Perhaps the most shocking revelation about Mussolini's regime came to light only after the war ended. Hidden in government archives were detailed records of medical experiments conducted on political prisoners and ethnic minorities. These experiments, conducted with Mussolini's explicit approval, violated every principle of medical ethics and human decency. The experiments were conducted at several facilities across Italy, the largest being a converted monastery outside Florence. Prisoners were subjected to tests designed to study pain tolerance, the effects of starvation, and responses to various toxins. The research had no legitimate medical purpose. It was torture disguised as science. One series of experiments involved injecting prisoners with various diseases to study progression and treatment options. But rather than seeking cures, the researchers were documenting how long it took for different ethnic groups to die from specific illnesses. The racial component was explicit. Mussolini wanted data to support his theories about Italian racial superiority. Temperature experiments pushed human endurance to fatal limits. Prisoners were subjected to extreme cold or heat, while researchers monitored their vital signs until death occurred. The data was meticulously recorded, creating a horrific catalog of human suffering that served no purpose beyond satisfying scientific curiosity, divorced from humanity. The psychological experiments were equally disturbing. Researchers studied the breaking points of human mental resilience by subjecting prisoners to constant noise, sleep deprivation, and sensory manipulation. Many subjects never recovered their sanity, spending their remaining years in a state of complete mental breakdown. These experiments continued right up until the regime's collapse, with the last recorded sessions taking place just weeks before Mussolini's death. The researchers showed no remorse. They viewed their work as contributing to fascist science and the advancement of Italian civilization. As Allied forces closed in on Italy in 1943, Mussolini's actions became increasingly desperate and vicious. Rather than accepting defeat, he unleashed a final wave of terror against his own people that surpassed even his previous cruelties. The establishment of the Italian Social Republic in northern Italy marked the beginning of Mussolini's most ruthless period. Cut off from central authority and facing inevitable defeat, he authorized his remaining forces to use any methods necessary to maintain control. The result was a reign of terror that traumatized northern Italy for generations. Partisan fighters and their families became targets of systematic extermination campaigns. Entire villages suspected of harboring resistance members were destroyed, their populations executed or deported. The methods were deliberately chosen for maximum psychological impact: public hangings, mass shootings in town squares, and the display of mutilated bodies as warnings to others. The massacre at Sant'Anna di Stazzema represents the depths of Mussolini's final desperation. SS troops, working with Italian fascist militia, surrounded the mountain village in August 1944. Over the course of several hours, they systematically murdered 560 civilians, including infants and elderly residents. The bodies were burned in the village church, which was then destroyed to erase evidence of the crime. Mussolini's personal involvement in planning these final atrocities was documented in messages intercepted by Allied intelligence. He explicitly ordered the elimination of entire communities as examples to others. His language grew increasingly unhinged, describing resistance fighters and their supporters as subhuman elements that needed to be cleansed from Italian soil. Even as his regime collapsed around him, Mussolini continued authorizing executions and deportations until the very end. His final documented order, signed just days before his capture, approved the execution of 50 political prisoners being held in Milan. The order was never carried out, only because Allied forces liberated the prison first. When Mussolini's bullet-riddled body was hung upside down in a Milan gas station in April 1945, it marked the end of one of history's most brutal dictatorships. But the full extent of his crimes would take decades to uncover, as investigators slowly pieced together the evidence of 23 years of systematic terror. The immediate aftermath of Mussolini's death revealed the true scope of his terror apparatus. Allied investigators discovered warehouses filled with torture devices, underground chambers where prisoners had been held for years, and filing cabinets containing detailed records of every atrocity committed in his name. The bureaucracy of death that Mussolini had created was staggering in its efficiency and thoroughness. One of the most disturbing discoveries was found in the basement of Mussolini's personal residence, a private collection of photographs documenting executions, torture sessions, and mass graves. These weren't official records kept for administrative purposes. They were personal trophies that Mussolini had collected over the years, evidence that he took pleasure in the suffering he had caused. Some photographs showed him personally present at interrogation sessions, watching as his enemies were broken physically and mentally. The numbers tell only part of the story. Conservative estimates place the death toll directly attributable to Mussolini's orders at over 400,000 people. This includes military casualties, civilian deaths from bombing campaigns, victims of concentration camps, those killed in political purges, and deaths from forced starvation policies. But these figures don't account for the indirect deaths, the suicides of those who couldn't bear the terror, the deaths from untreated medical conditions in labor camps, or the children who died from malnutrition in occupied territories. More comprehensive research conducted in the 1990s suggests the actual death toll may have exceeded 700,000 people. This figure includes previously undocumented massacres in Africa, deaths in Italian concentration camps that were never officially recorded, and the systematic elimination of disabled individuals under programs that predated similar Nazi policies by several years. Perhaps more disturbing than the scale of Mussolini's crimes was their calculated nature. These were not crimes of passion or wartime desperation. They were carefully planned policies designed to terrorize populations into submission. Every major atrocity can be traced back to specific orders bearing Mussolini's signature or documented conversations where he personally approved the methods to be used. The discovery of Mussolini's personal journals provided unprecedented insight into his mindset. Written in his own hand, these documents revealed a man who viewed cruelty as a necessary tool of governance and took pride in his ability to inspire fear. In one entry, dated 1936, he wrote about the Ethiopian campaign with disturbing satisfaction, describing the terror on civilians' faces as the birth of a new Roman Empire written in blood and fire. His relationship with violence evolved throughout his reign, becoming increasingly personal and sadistic. Early in his career, Mussolini delegated brutal acts to subordinates, but as his power grew, so did his direct involvement. Survivors of his later interrogation sessions described a man who had become addicted to the power of inflicting suffering, someone who found genuine pleasure in breaking the human spirit. The international community's failure to stop Mussolini earlier enabled his worst excesses. His success in Ethiopia, his annexation of Albania, and his early victories in World War II all convinced him that the world would tolerate any level of brutality as long as he maintained the appearance of political legitimacy. By the time the full extent of his crimes became apparent, hundreds of thousands were already dead. The League of Nations' weak response to the Ethiopian invasion was particularly consequential. When Mussolini used chemical weapons against civilian populations, the international community imposed only token sanctions that had no real impact on Italy's ability to wage war. This tepid response sent a clear message to other potential aggressors that the civilized world lacked the will to enforce its own moral standards. Even more damaging was the admiration Mussolini received from prominent figures in democratic countries. Business leaders praised his efficiency, politicians admired his ability to make decisive decisions, and intellectuals wrote favorably about fascist achievements in infrastructure and economic development. This international validation provided moral cover for increasingly extreme policies and convinced Mussolini that his methods were not only acceptable, but admirable. The legacy of Mussolini's reign extends far beyond the immediate victims. His methods influenced other dictators around the world, providing a blueprint for how democratic institutions could be systematically destroyed from within. His propaganda techniques, his use of mass rallies to create artificial consensus, and his exploitation of economic anxieties became standard tools of authoritarian regimes throughout the 20th century. The true horror of Benito Mussolini's reign lies not just in the scale of his crimes, but in their deliberate systematic nature. From the earliest days of the fascist movement through his final desperate acts as a puppet ruler, Mussolini consistently chose the most brutal methods available to achieve his goals. He pioneered techniques of mass terror that would be adopted by dictators around the world, leaving a legacy of suffering that extended far beyond Italy's borders. What makes Mussolini's story particularly chilling is how ordinary people became complicit in extraordinary evil. The transformation of Italian society under fascism wasn't just imposed from above, it required the active participation of millions of citizens who chose to look the other way, inform on their neighbors, or actively participate in the machinery of terror. Teachers who expelled Jewish students, doctors who conducted medical experiments, police officers who carried out midnight arrests, each played a role in making Mussolini's vision of terror a reality. The psychological impact of Mussolini's reign extended far beyond his death. Survivors carried trauma that affected multiple generations. Children who witnessed their parents' arrests grew up with deep psychological scars. Communities that experienced mass executions never fully recovered their social fabric. The culture of fear that Mussolini created poisoned Italian society for decades after his death, creating lasting divisions and mistrust that persist to this day. Perhaps most disturbing is how Mussolini's methods have been replicated by authoritarian leaders throughout history. The playbook he developed, exploiting economic anxiety, scapegoating minority groups, using violence to silence opposition, and gradually dismantling democratic institutions, has been followed by dictators on every continent. His techniques for manipulating mass media, staging dramatic public spectacles, and creating personality cults became standard practices for authoritarian regimes worldwide. The rehabilitation of Mussolini's image in some quarters represents one of history's most successful propaganda campaigns. Decades after his death, some still praise his supposed achievements in infrastructure and economic development, conveniently ignoring the human cost of his policies. This selective memory demonstrates how easily societies can forget the lessons of history when those lessons prove inconvenient or uncomfortable. Understanding these crimes serves as more than historical education. It provides crucial insight into how democratic societies can be systematically destroyed by those who exploit fear and resentment for political gain. Mussolini's rise to power followed a predictable pattern that has been repeated in various forms throughout history. His methods of consolidating control, eliminating opposition, and maintaining power through terror offer sobering lessons about the fragility of civilized society. The investigation of Mussolini's crimes continues even today, as historians uncover new evidence and survivors finally feel safe enough to share their stories. DNA analysis has helped identify victims of mass graves. Declassified documents have revealed previously unknown atrocities, and oral history projects have preserved testimonies that might otherwise have been lost forever. Each new discovery adds another layer to our understanding of how thoroughly Mussolini corrupted every aspect of Italian society. The victims of Mussolini's regime, the political prisoners, the Ethiopian civilians, the Jewish families, the resistance fighters, and countless others, deserve to be remembered not just as statistics, but as individuals whose lives were cut short by one man's ruthless ambition. Their stories remind us that the greatest crimes in history are ultimately personal tragedies multiplied beyond comprehension. Maria Benedetti was a schoolteacher who refused to remove Jewish children from her classroom. She was arrested in 1938 and died in prison 6 months later. Giuseppe Molinari was a journalist who wrote articles critical of the Ethiopian War. He was beaten to death by black shirts in 1936. Sarah Goldstein was 8 years old when she was deported to Auschwitz with her family in 1943. She never returned. These names represent thousands of others whose individual stories have been lost to history, but whose collective suffering stands as testimony to the depths of human evil. Today, as democratic institutions face new challenges around the world, the example of Mussolini's Italy serves as a stark warning about what can happen when societies allow fear to override their commitment to human dignity and democratic values. The price of freedom, as these victims learned too late, is eternal vigilance against those who would trade liberty for the illusion of security and strength. The most important lesson from Mussolini's reign is that such horrors don't happen overnight. They develop gradually, through a series of small compromises and moral concessions that seem reasonable at the time, but collectively pave the way for unthinkable atrocities. Understanding this process, how ordinary people become complicit in extraordinary evil, may be our best defense against ensuring that the diabolical legacy of Benito Mussolini never finds new expression in our modern world. The warning signs were there for those willing to see them. The escalating violence, the systematic dehumanization of opponents, the gradual erosion of legal protections, the celebration of brutality as strength. All of these elements combined to create a society where mass murder became not just possible, but inevitable. Recognizing these patterns before they reach their terrible conclusion remains one of humanity's greatest challenges and most urgent responsibilities. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.